Hello everybody, welcome to our 8th lecture in the series Competition Policy and Strategy. Today we're going to talk about the second part in our merger assessment or merger control lecture, and this lecture is going to be mainly about vertical mergers. Before we start with the topic, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel. And also feel free to leave comments or questions down below. We're happy to answer your questions, and whatever you want to discuss, we're happy to get you covered. So, in the last lecture, we have been talking about horizontal mergers, and we have been talking about how to assess them and how they are treated in competition policy and practice. Today we're going to do basically the same assessment, however we're now looking at vertical mergers. The point with vertical mergers is that we have to look at so-called upstream and downstream markets, and this is basically you can visualize this as different parts of the value chain. So we have, for instance, multiple manufacturers serving multiple retailers, and if one of these or more of the manufacturers merge with one or more of the retailers, then this is a vertical merger. A merger between two manufacturers or two retailers would be horizontal. In general, you can think about this as different parts of the value chain. It doesn't have to be about manufacturers or retailers. It could also be about wholesalers and retailers. It could also be concerned with different areas of an economy or of an industry, where, for instance, there is a merger between the company that is responsible for the rails and a company that is responsible for the transport of goods or people, right? That would also be a vertical merger. If we look at the guidelines of the European Commission, and it's no different in other jurisdictions, vertical mergers or non-horizontal mergers in general are much less of an issue in terms of how they are considered as in terms of competition policy. And in the guidelines of the European Commission, so here you have the exact number and the quote, it is said that these non-horizontal mergers pose no threat to effective competition unless the merged entity has a significant degree of market power in at least one of the markets concerned. And you see here that no such concern is given when the following points are satisfied. So the post-merger market share in each of the market is below 30%, and the HHI post-merger is below 2000. That's less restrictive in general than what we had in terms of horizontal mergers. However, there are exceptions when we have strong growth in one of the merged entities, when we have cross-shareholdings, or when we eliminate a maverick, so a firm that is basically thought of as a firm that is pushing the market forward in terms of innovation or price leadership, whatever. And then also when we have when there was collusion in the past or some coordination of the firms, then we have a problem with the merger usually. One of the central pieces that we can analyze right away is the problem of double marginalization. It can easily be visualized when we look at a downstream and an upstream monopolist. So when we have one manufacturer and one retailer, for instance. And we assume that the monopolist has constant marginal cost C in production, we have no fixed costs, and we assume that the monopolist sells to the downstream firm at a wholesale price of W, right? And the downstream firm is also a monopolist, and in order to sell the product, it has to buy it from the upstream monopolist at a wholesale price W. We have no further costs of distribution in the downstream level, and the downstream monopolist sells to the final customers at a retail price P. So what happens is basically that the downstream monopolist's costs of buying the product, the marginal cost basically, is now W and not C. And this W is determined endogenously because it is determined on an upstream level. So that's basically, from a pure theory perspective, that's the difference. From the demand side of the final customers is Q is A minus P, so standard linear demand function. And if we want to determine what happens in equilibrium, we first have to look at the downstream monopolist. And she buys for a given quantity. It sells that quantity for a price W. The downstream monopolist buys the product for at a given wholesale price W, and the downstream monopolist's profits is here pi d as a function of Q, so the quantity it sells or buys, and the wholesale price W. Again, recall that wholesale price is now determined endogenously, so it's a variable in this problem. And of course, we want to maximize our profits. That's why we have a maximization over Q here. That's just by assumption here. And if you look at the profit function, it looks relatively familiar. So we have A minus Q, which is the price. So the first part of the term in parentheses, minus W, which is now the marginal costs from the viewpoint of the downstream form. So usually, if you have a simple monopoly here without upstream-downstream problem, then there's only a C. Now we have that W here, which is the endogenous wholesale price. And if we differentiate this function and rearrange with respect to Q, we get to the term A minus W over 2. That is quite familiar, as it is the monopolist's output for a given marginal costs, here W. What we now do is to rearrange this equation with respect to W, so we multiply by 2 and we add W and subtract Q, and then we get to the, we add W and subtract 2Q, and then we get to this, to the inverse demand that the upstream monopolist faces, W as a function of Q, which is A minus 2Q. So this inverse demand is basically what the upstream firm anticipates the downstream firm to buy, or that the price that will ensue for a given quantity. So it knows, the upstream monopolist knows that if it produces a certain amount of output Q, then the wholesale price W will take the form, right? So if A is, for instance, 10 and Q would be 2, then our wholesale price in equilibrium would be 10 minus 4, so 6, right? That's the inverse demand function that the upstream monopolist faces. And now the question is, what quantity should the upstream monopolist produce? Well, the profit maximizing quantity. So what we set up is the upstream firm's profit function, pi u as a function of Q. And this is the wholesale price W of Q, which we have just determined as A minus 2Q, minus C, which is the marginal cost of the upstream firm, times Q, as this is the margin. And now we get, if we maximize that, so the only unknown is Q, so we get the solution here directly, which is A minus C over 4. And that's what we call Q pre, so the pre-merger quantity. And if we compare that to the monopoly solution that we know, we immediately see that this is half the monopoly quantity. So we immediately can imagine that there is some inefficiency that is introduced in the market here. And if you want, you can determine the price, the wholesale price, downstream profits and upstream profits in that pre-merger equilibrium, and you will see that the values that we have just written down here ensue. And the problem is that we have what we call double marginalization. And the problem is easily visualized if we imagine the value chain, which is the upstream monopolist produces something, it sells what it produces to the downstream monopolist, and the downstream monopolist sells to the final customers. And since they both have a monopoly position, we can anticipate that basically if they don't internalize anything, that the upstream monopolists charges monopolistic markup on its marginal costs. The downstream monopolist buys at this already inflated price, which already has a monopolistic margin in it. That's what they pay as marginal costs. And given this wholesale price, the downstream firm additionally adds a monopolistic overcharge to this already monopolistically overcharged marginal production costs, and we get to a point where we basically have 2 times a monopolistic overcharge in the price, right? And that's basically the problem that we are facing. And the result is that the retail prices are inefficiently high and the quantities are inefficiently low. And that not only from the social welfare perspective, so the consumers are worse off, but also from a firm perspective, as profits could be increased. Basically by definition, because we know that the monopolist, if it was controlling the entire value chain, would only put one time the monopolistic overcharge on the given marginal costs, as this is basically the monopolistic outcome, right? And the thing is that if we have a vertical merger, and that's the next situation, if the upstream firm and the downstream firm merge, then we can internalize or avoid this problem of double marginalization. So how does this happen? So what they do is that they maximize joint profits, which looks like I didn't translate that. So give in downstream and give in upstream should be profit downstream and profit upstream. And this joint profit function is basically just what does the downstream firm earn plus what would the upstream firm earn. And what we see is that this green term, which is basically the wholesale price, is just a redistribution of profits between upstream and downstream firms. And if we maximize profits jointly as a result of the merger, then we know that this transaction price, this internal transaction price W, is basically irrelevant, right? So it cancels out here because it is something that the downstream firm pays and the upstream firm earns. So we have plus for the upstream firm and minus for the downstream firm, and the term vanishes. So what we are left with is P minus C times Q as the joint profits, and that's the standard monopoly solution, right? And what we see is that if we maximize this joint profit function, which is basically only the simple monopoly solution, we get to the monopoly output, which is the post-merger output here. And the interesting thing is that the equilibrium prices now fall to the monopolistic level and not this double marginalization solution, which leads to even higher prices, which means that prices due to the merger to monopoly in this situation would be lower than in the initial situation. And joint profits increase as well, right? And if prices fall and profits increase, then it's clear that this is an efficient situation from an economic perspective, right? So because the consumers are better off and the producers are better off. So that's an efficiency gain. And that's one reason why vertical mergers can be much less of a problem, as they can internalize this negative impact of double marginalization. Of course, in reality, life could be more difficult, because you can imagine that if we have two monopolists along the value chain, they would probably engage in negotiations. And if they negotiate, they would be smart enough to internalize this inefficiency that comes from double marginalization, and they know that, okay, if we agree on some allocation of profits along the value chain, then we would set then we could solve this problem, right? And that would be the situation would be, okay, downstream firm charges the monopoly price, upstream firm charges a price equals marginal costs, or sorry, a price equals marginal cost could be possible, and then the profits are basically shifted around based on a bargaining problem. But that dual monopoly problem is basically subject to a large, world of its own, because that's basically the subject of bargain. And we don't tackle that here, but it's very interesting and something that you can do at that point. Which really illuminating on how the surplus is distributed between the two parties here. That's something that would be analyzed in that respect. Okay, so based on this, we have realized that the elimination of double marginalization is a potential efficiency effect. It probably is not much of an issue when we talk about this double monopoly problem, but it probably gets more realistic if we have an oligopoly that is characterized by linear prices. So no serious negotiations, but more like posted prices. Then double marginalization or the elimination of it would be an efficiency effect. However, if we look at Bertrand competition, it basically doesn't occur. Double marginalization would be no issue here, right? But again, we have been talking about the monopoly situation. There could be other efficiencies that we can think of, right? So we could internalize horizontal externalities, for instance, if we talk about service provision on a downstream level, which we will do, or which we will look at towards the end of our lecture series. So we don't talk about that much about that here at the moment. So we just postpone that topic. But there could also be other things like long-term projects between the upstream and the downstream firm, which, for instance, would need the alignment of production processes. So if you have basically some very special product that you want to produce, and that special product relies special inputs or production technologies, then it makes sense to sit together and merge to get the production efficient, right? However, there is one central problem with vertical mergers. Maybe others, but one central problem is foreclosure. And what that means, we will look at in the following slides. When we talk about foreclosure, one central piece would be input foreclosure. The other would be customer foreclosure. We first talk about input foreclosure. In order to get input foreclosure, to get an understanding of what input foreclosure would be, we look at a situation where we have an upstream monopolist who produces a homogeneous product at constant marginal cost C, and the monopolist sells the product to the downstream firm at a given price W. On the downstream level, we have a conoduopoly with two symmetric firms that buy the product from the monopolist upstream at a given price W, and they sell the product to the final consumers at price P without any further costs. The demand of the final customers is standard linear form A minus P, and what we do is to analyze a merger between the upstream monopolist and one downstream firm. So it's a little bit different from what we had before, where we only had one downstream firm. Now we have two, and we basically have a merger between the upstream monopolist and one of the downstream firms. So the other firm is not involved in the merger. So how can we analyze the situation pre-merger? So what we basically have to do is to use backwards induction, because what we need is something like an inverse demand function that determines what the wholesale price would be from the viewpoint of the upstream firm, right? So the same thing that we did with the dual monopoly situation. So what we do is to look at one downstream firm, and that one downstream firm, so recall that they compete à la Cournot, so one downstream firm is basically characterized as, or maximizes its profits, which is basically a Cournot problem with the small difference that W, the wholesale price, which is the marginal costs of the downstream firm, is not a parameter, but a variable. But from the viewpoint of the downstream firm, pre-merger, it is a given. So it's basically can be treated as a constant here. So what we do is we maximize profits over the choice of Q for pi I, so for the firm I here, and firm I's profit is a function of Qi, Qj, and W. And here we have the first part, which we are familiar with as a Cournot setup, which is basically A minus Qi minus Qj. This is the price. And we subtract W, which is the wholesale price. So the first part in parentheses here is basically P, which is this first three terms here, A minus Q in total, and Q is Qi plus Qj. And we subtract the wholesale price W, which is basically the marginal cost at the downstream level. So what we have in parentheses here is P minus W, so the margin, times Qi, which is the output, so margin times output, profits. And we do that for our firms 1 and 2, and you know that they are symmetric, so the problem will be quite easy in the end. But what we first do is to differentiate this function with respect to Qi, and then we get first order condition, and we rearrange this first order condition to get to Qi as a function of Qj and W, of course. W is here the another from the viewpoint of the problem, it's another endogenous variable. So what we get is basically the standard Cournot reaction function, which is A minus marginal costs minus Qj over 2. And since Qi and Qj are the same, we can just rearrange for Qi. If we just bring Q, we just assume that Qi and Qj are the same, bring it to the other side here, and rearrange so that we get to A minus W over 3 as the symmetric output of a single downstream firm, right? When we want to get a relation between quantity and price, wholesale price, we have to keep in mind that we have two downstream firms. So Qi is the output of one of those downstream firms. So what we want to have as total output is 2 times this Qi. And thereby we see that we have 2 times A minus W over 3, which is the total output, total industry output at the downstream level. And we just take this equation, Q is equal to 2 times A minus W over 3, and rearrange with respect to W to get to the inverse demand function that the upstream firm faces, which is A minus 3 over 2 times Q, right? So just rearrange this equation here to get to that point. And that is what we need in order to determine the equilibrium output pre-merger, and we can easily get there by substituting this W as a function of Q into our upstream monopolists' profits, which is basically the wholesale price W minus the marginal cost in production C times the output Q, right? So here we have the wholesale price as a function of Q. The upstream firm is a monopolist, so it anticipates that there is a price effect if it changes output, so this is a function of Q. And here we have the marginal cost in production, so W minus C, which is the margin, times Q, which is then the output, the profits. And what we do is to differentiate this function with respect to Q, set the resulting equation equal to 0, and rearrange with respect to Q, so which is A minus 6 over 2 times Q, so 3 minus C equals 0, and we get the 3Q to the other, we add 3Q to this equation, so that we have A minus C is equal to 3Q, and we just divide the resulting expression by 3, and we get to pre-merger output here. And that's total output. Okay, so based on this total output, we can determine the entire market equilibrium. So we can easily compute the output that a single downstream firm buys or sells, and that's just half of the industry output A minus C over 3. So each downstream firm buys half of the production of the upstream firm. And the price pre-merger is simply A minus C over 3 substituted into the inverse demand function, A minus Q. Our wholesale price is simply here A minus C over 3 plugged into this one here, and we get to A plus C over 2. And then we can determine upstream profits of a single downstream firm as well as consumer surplus. And you see that here. So it's just, you can practice it based on these results. Okay, so now what happens if we have a merger between one of the downstream firms and the upstream monopolist? So first, keep in mind that the symmetry assumption now disappears, right? So if we just assume for the ease of presentation that we have a merger between firm 1 and the upstream monopolist, but that's just without loss of generality. You can easily swap the 1 and the 2, basically. So it doesn't really matter for the understanding. And what we do is then to analyze the profit function of our vertically integrated firm. So that's the central part here. And the equation looks longer and a little bit more complicated than what we had before, but it's relatively straightforward to interpret. So how do our profits look like? So we use the index VI here to refer to our vertically integrated entity, which is the joint entity of the downstream of downstream firm 1 and the upstream monopolist. And how does this how does the profit function or how does profits of this merged entity look like? Well, it basically has 3 parts. It has the profit that the own downstream firm, so downstream firm 1, realizes. It has the it incurs it has profits that from the upstream firm selling to the other downstream firm. Sorry, I think I swapped the indices here. So just swap this one with this one. So the first part here, which has the green W1 in it, is the profits of the vertically integrated firm from by selling the product that is produced by the own upstream monopolist and sold to the own downstream firm. So this is the profit that the firm VI, the vertically integrated firm, realizes from selling the product to the own downstream firm, which is firm 1 by definition. And the last term here is the profits that the upstream monopolist realizes from selling the product to the other non-vertically integrated downstream firm. So the first 2 parts here are basically what happens inside the firm, and the third part is what happens if we produce something and sell it to our rival downstream retailer, right? So that's the idea. And we immediately see, and that's marked in green, that the wholesale price that downstream retailer 1 pays, so the merged retailer pays, is basically again a redistribution between what the upstream monopolist earns and what the downstream retailer pays. So this is just again a redistribution, as was the case with our double marginalization example. So that's just basically shifting around profits between inside the merged entity now. So that will be irrelevant for the final outcome. And again, we see that here from the viewpoint of the upstream of the downstream firm. It is costs, so it has a minus, And from the viewpoint of the upstream firm, it is a profit or revenue, and it has a plus. So it basically cancels out, and what we are left with, if we factor out Q1 here, is A minus Q1 minus Q2 minus C times Q1. That's the profit that the merged entity realizes from basically its own business, right? So producing upstream, selling to the own downstream retailer. And the remaining term is what the merged entity earns from producing upstream and selling to the rival retailer, right? So that's the idea. Okay, now we want to look at downstream firm 2, right? We need, from a mathematical standpoint here, in these first two terms here, if you merge them, or if you just factor out Q here, Q1, you get to an expression that has no unknown anymore, right? So it's only Q1 that is endogenous here, and Q1 and Q2 that is endogenous. However, if we look here, there's the W2, and we don't know that W2 as it should be a function of Q1 and Q2, because that's basically the wholesale price that arises when selling a given quantity to the rival manufacturer, to the rival retailer, and selling a given quantity to the own retailer, right? So we basically need a function that maps that tells us how high is the wholesale price for firm 2 given that we produce or sell a given quantity to our own retailer and to the other retailer. Okay? And in order to get this equation, we have to look at the other downstream, to look at downstream firm 2, so the firm, the retailer that is not involved in the merger. And how can we do that? Well, we have a maximization problem here. So downstream firm 2 maximizes its profits over the choice of its own output Q2. And the profit function of Q2 of firm 2 is a function of Q1, Q2, and W2. And as it is a Cournot example here, we have A minus Q1 minus Q2, which is again the price, minus, so the retail price, and W2 is our marginal costs from the viewpoint of firm 2, which is the wholesale price that firm 2 pays, right? And if we rearrange, or if we first differentiate the equation here, we get to A minus Q1 minus 2Q2 minus W2 should be equal to 0, and we rearrange with respect to W2, we get to an expression that says A minus Q1 minus 2Q2, and that one we can substitute here, right? And if we have that, then we have a profit function for the vertically integrated firm that only depends on Q1 and Q2, right? So we have Q1 here, Q2 here, W1 cancels out, and for W2 we now have a function that only depends on Q1 and Q2. So what we can do is to substitute W2 into this equation and then differentiate with respect to Q1 and Q2, and what you will see is that for our post-merger situation, we get for firm 1 the monopolistic output, and for firm 2 we get basically a corner solution where firm 2 is no longer served, right? And that's the foreclosure aspect here. You will see how this can be exactly calculated on the final slide of this lecture, which is basically where we basically explain that in more detail, how we get to that solution. Okay, in any case, the economics behind it is that we now see a situation that is characterized by input foreclosure. So what does it mean? Input foreclosure has to be a situation where there's a downstream firm that's not involved in the merger and that is not able to get the output the input that it needs in order to sell something to its customers. That's why it's called input foreclosure, because you don't get the good that you can sell, or you don't get an important input that you can sell. So what does this mean is that on the downstream level we have a weakening, or in this case an elimination of competition, because we basically have cut out firm 2 from the market entirely. However, in the example, we again have the elimination of double marginalization, right? And that's the efficiency effect. So we basically have two effects that play a role here, so we have to look at what happens. And the interesting thing is that if we compute vertically the industry profits, then we see that the profit of the vertically integrated entity, so that a firm that consists of the upstream monopolist and one of the downstream retailers, has basically monopoly profits, which is clear because we've just removed firm 2 from the market, and what the remaining firms do as they are merged is to generate monopoly profits, just basically as in the double marginalization example. So they basically have monopoly profits, and if we look at the joint profits, or the sum of the profits of all the firms in the market in the pre-merger situation, so the profits of firm 1, firm 2, and the upstream monopolist, we get to a value a minus c over 2, to the power of 2 over 6, which is basically smaller than the monopoly profits, right? So the merger raises industry profits, and the merger also raises consumer surplus, as again the post-merger prices, a plus c over 2, which is the monopoly price, is lower than the pre-merger price. Right? So we eliminate again the problem of double marginalization, and that leads to lower prices, which in turn translates to high consumer surplus. So what we have is that the merger leads to input foreclosure. However, the elimination of double marginalization overcompensates that, and interestingly, we have a welfare enhancing merger here. So from the viewpoint of our merger control, we would look at the merger and say, okay, it might have detrimental effects on competition, but from a purely static perspective, we should allow the merger because input foreclosure is negative, but we have eliminated double marginalization, so the efficiency gain is much stronger. So we should allow the merger from both a consumer surplus and a welfare standpoint. Okay. So, if we looked at the entire situation from a Bertrand perspective, then the merger would be of completely no effect. Because from a downstream level, we have as marginal costs the wholesale price, and we know that we have a homogeneous product and no difference between the downstream retailers, so they will undercut each other until price equals marginal cost, which is W here. So it has no effect, the merger. If we stick to that situation and assume that from a double monopoly situation, that's just, so the merger has no effect in Bertrand. Okay, so we have been talking about input foreclosure now. The other thing, so the other foreclosure type would be customer foreclosure. So you can probably think about what happens already when we have two downstream firms and one upstream firm. What can happen is that the the downstream firm that is not involved in the merger might be cut out of the market by being foreclosed from the input. And if we want to have customer foreclosure, we must have a situation where where we have two upstream firms at least, and a downstream firm that, upon merger, no longer buys its product from the non-merging upstream producer. And that's called customer foreclosure because the upstream producer that is not involved in the merger has no longer the chance to reach a customer. Right? So it's cut off from the market, basically. Okay, so how do we analyze that situation? Well, we basically look at a similar problem to above. However, we assume that we have symmetric Cournot duopolists on an upstream level. They produce with constant marginal cost C and sell to the downstream firm at a wholesale price W. The downstream monopolist buys the product at price W and sells to the final customers at price P. And the demand of the final customers is again A minus P. And what we do is to analyze the merger between one upstream firm and the downstream monopolist. Right? So basically the mirror image of what we have analyzed before. Okay, so look at the pre-merger situation first. What we do is, again, to look at the downstream firm first, because we want to have a relationship that tells us how high the wholesale price will be. And the downstream firm is a monopolist, so what basically happens is, given the wholesale price as marginal costs, it maximizes its profits, knowing that with a given quantity Q, the price will be A minus Q. So the profits of the downstream monopolist will look like so here, where we have A minus Q, which is the price, minus W, which is basically the wholesale price as marginal costs. So we basically have a monopoly problem here. We differentiate with respect to capital Q, which is A minus 2Q minus W equals 0, rearrange with respect to Q, and you get to A minus W over Q, which is the monopoly output on the downstream level. Okay, so we just rearrange this one with respect to Q to get to an inverse demand function that the upstream duopolists face, right? And that inverse demand function is basically, so just rearrange that one with respect to W and you get to this inverse demand function here. And it has double the slope of the original demand function or the demand function of the final customers. Okay, so what do the upstream duopolists do? Well, they compete à la Cournot. So what we have is this profit here of firm I, which is a function of what firm I produces and of what firm J produces. And here the crucial price that they get as revenue for selling a unit is basically the wholesale price. So what we do is to substitute this relationship for the wholesale price as a function of the total output, noting that Q, capital Q, is the sum of what firm I produces and what firm J produces. So capital Q is Qi plus Qj, and then we substitute here this wholesale price A minus 2 capital Q, Qi plus Qj, and we note that the marginal costs on upstream level are small c, so our margin is basically the wholesale price at a given quantity minus marginal costs, that's the margin times the output, so we get our profits. And in order to get to a solution, we just differentiate the function again with respect to Qi, and what we get is A minus 4Qi minus 2Qj minus C equals 0, and we just rearrange with respect to Qi, noting that Qi and Qj are the same. That's why we have the symmetry assumption here, because the two upstream firms are pre-merger symmetric. And we get to this equilibrium output of a single upstream duopolist in the pre-merger situation, right? This output is produced basically twice, because we have two upstream duopolists. Sorry, that doesn't make sense. So we have an upstream duopoly, so two upstream firms. And this output will be produced twice, and that's what we substitute into our wholesale price and into our customer or final retail price. And this is our retail price, 2A plus C over 3. This is our wholesale price, A plus 2C over 3. And if we look at the situation, this here, A plus 2C over 3, is basically what we would observe in monopoly. So this is basically a price that will decrease in the end. So there is room for improvement, and we have for the upstream firm this as the profit. For one downstream firms we have this as the profit here, and for our consumer surplus we see that this is the result. Okay, now looking at a merger between one upstream firm and the downstream monopolist. So again, a similar setup or concept that we had applied when we were talking about the input foreclosure topic. So just a merger between the only downstream firm and one of the upstream firms, and without loss of generality, we again assume that we have a merger, that we have firm one involved in the merger. And we again start the analysis by looking at the profit of the vertically integrated entity. So again, index VI. And that vertically integrated entity consists of the downstream monopolist and one of the upstream producers. So the profit again has three parts. And that these three parts are basically what the downstream monopolists earns from selling the products of the own upstream firm, which is firm one. So everything that firm one produces can be sold by the downstream firm, and that is the first part here. The second part is what the downstream firm can sell that was produced by firm 2, which is the producer that is not involved in the merger, right? So that is basically the profits that are generated from outside of the merged entity. And the last part here is basically the profit that is generated by from the upstream firm 1, which sells its product to the own downstream retailer, right? And we again see that what the downstream firm buys from its own upstream producer is basically that price, that wholesale price, W1, is irrelevant because it basically is a redistribution between the upstream producer that is merged and the downstream monopolist, right? So the higher the wholesale price within this merged entity, the lower the profits will be of the downstream monopolist, and the higher the profits will be of the own producer, right? But from the viewpoint of the merged entity, it doesn't matter. Okay, so what we can do again is to put together this term here with this term, noting that here we have minus W1, here we have plus W1, so we can just put this together, and then we have A minus Q1 minus Q2 minus C times Q1. And that would be the profit that is generated within the merged entity, noting that W1 is irrelevant here. And the remaining term, here the middle term, is basically the term in the middle. That's basically what the merged entity earns from selling the product that is produced by the non-merged or non-merging producer. Okay, so if we now differentiate this this function with respect to Q1 and Q2, we can get to first a reaction function of the of firm 1 as a function of C, and what we also get is a relationship between the wholesale price that firm 2 can realize, right? So it's important to do it that way, because the other way you wouldn't have an inverse demand function that the upstream firm 2 would realize. So you again need to apply backwards induction, so you have to start at the second stage, and that second stage involves the merged entity. So we at that point have to use W2 as an unknown and get a relationship, an inverse demand function that we can that we need in order to maximize firm 2's profit here. So from the viewpoint of firm 2, we are still in Cournot competition, so we know that this price for which firm 2 that firm 2 realizes is again a function of what firm 1 produces and what firm 2 produces. And taking this into account, we can determine or first set up the second firm's profit, which is the wholesale price that firm 2 realizes as a function of Q1 and Q2, minus the marginal costs of production times Q2, which is again here, the first part in parentheses here is the margin, and Q2 is the output, so output times margin would be profits. And if we differentiate this function with respect to Q2, we get to this reaction function here, which now only depends on Q1 actually. So if we use then, now we have here a reaction function of firm 1 as a function of Q2, and here we have a reaction function of Q2 of firm 2, which is a function of what firm 1 produces. So what we want is to determine an equilibrium, which is basically a fixed point, or in this case just an intersection point between this Q1 as a function of Q2 and Q2 as a function of Q1. So we basically just solve these two equations here simultaneously, and what you see is that for firm 2 we have over 4 here, for firm 1 we have over 2 here, so they look pretty similar but different in the end. And if we solve that, what we can basically see is that the output of firm 1, so the merged upstream producer, is A minus C over 2, monopoly output, and the output of firm 2, the rival or the non-merged producer here, is 0, right? So firm 2 doesn't produce anything, and firm 1 produces the monopoly output, and they sell that to, or the merged entity sells that to the final customers. So what basically happens is that the downstream monopolist now only buys from the own vertically integrated producer, and the other upstream producer is foreclosed. So it's basically cut off from the market. So that's customer foreclosure, right? And again, you can do the whole calculus here. You can look at the last slide where we have determined that the merger raises, again, industry profits. It raises consumer surplus. And why is that? Well, basically, again, we have an elimination of double marginalization, as I have just hinted at the former slides here. When you look at the prices, they are above the monopoly level at the end, so the retail prices, and now they are at the monopoly level. So they have decreased, and if prices decrease, consumer surplus goes up in the given example. So it's good for the consumers, and also industry profits go up because we have just eliminated double marginalization, and that leads to an efficient outcome. So again, we have an efficiency effect from eliminating double marginalization that overcompensates our suppression of upstream competition that arises from the merger. So basically, from a purely static perspective, we would again say the merger is efficiency enhancing. Okay, so now if we want to look at foreclosure, or how foreclosure is dealt with in actual cases, we can have a look at the European Commission's guidelines here in paragraph 29. Here it is said what foreclosure actually is. So it's basically the thing that we have not talked about is that what happens to potential rivals, right? And that's an aspect that we see in this quote here. A merger is said to result in foreclosure where actual or potential rivals' access to supplies or markets is hampered or eliminated as a result of the merger, thereby reducing these companies' ability and or incentive to compete, right? So supplier markets, access to supplies or markets is again input foreclosure or customer foreclosure, and the thing is that we want to look also at potential rivals. And what is also related to this potential rivals is that such foreclosure may discourage entry or expansion of rivals or encourage their exit. So what we had in the example is that the merged entity basically removed the remaining firm from the market, so that would be exit. But if you look at this from a dynamic perspective, there would not be any entry into that market because they would anticipate that they will end up in the same situation as the entity that wasn't involved in the merger, right? So we have exit and we won't expect any entry. Ceteris paribus. Okay, so what is important here also is to look at the final sentence, and that says that such foreclosure is regarded as anti-competitive, where the merging companies and possibly some of its competitors are, as a result, able to profitably increase the price charged to consumers. And that's the thing that we didn't have in the example, right? Because in the example, we saw even decreases in prices. And that is one reason that double marginalization, why potentially mergers, vertical mergers, aren't so much of a problem, or are considered not so much of a problem in actual competition policy. Now, if you want, or if the commission, or if some expert wants to assess whether there is foreclosure, what you do is to basically first look at the ability to foreclose and the incentive to foreclose. And then you look at the effect of the foreclosure. So that's the three-step procedure here. If we look at our cases, is the ability to foreclose given? Well, no problem. We have just one input that was either not supplied to the non-merged entity or not bought from the non-merged entity. So the ability to foreclose was definitely given. The incentive to foreclose was also given because the firms could increase their profits, so the foreclosure would be profitable. And the effect of the foreclosure would, in our case, that would be basically a nah, because the foreclosure didn't hurt the consumers. So there would probably be what we call foreclosure, but it's not a problem because there are other effects that that overcompensates for the foreclosure effect. Okay, so if we look at this from a real-life perspective, then it gets more difficult, right? There could be dynamic effects that play a role: entry, exit, innovation, quality, whatsoever. And one example of a recent merger that is where there's a lot of discussion on that, but probably right now only in the industry, is the merger between Microsoft and some of the most very large game developers such as Blizzard and Bethesda and stuff like that. So if you look at the gaming console market, then there's Sony, which has its PlayStation, and Microsoft with its Xbox. And the concern of Sony is, of course, that they would be foreclosed from the games developed by Blizzard, Bethesda, and so on, which are now basically vertically integrated with Microsoft, and they would be foreclosed from the market. And Microsoft would argue that it's not a problem because we cannot, we as Microsoft, we cannot, we need to develop the games also for PlayStation, as these consumers we wouldn't otherwise reach, right? And that's basically the discussion that would have to be assessed by a competition authority, right? So just to make clear, I have no insights into anything here regarding the case. That's just a mere description, and I don't have any definite opinion on that because I'm not involved at the point, right? So it's a very interesting thing, and it's just, we will see what happens. Okay, so to finish things up, we have to look at a third class of mergers. We have talked about horizontal mergers, vertical mergers, and the only thing that is left is basically so-called conglomerate mergers. And a conglomerate merger is considered a merger where we basically have two firms merging that produce completely different products, unrelated products or goods in completely different product markets, right? And examples would be Time Warner AT&T or Axel Springer VIII Sat.1. So one party, for instance, produces newspapers and articles and stuff like that, and the other firm is basically a television company, basically. So they serve. They are probably not even. They don't produce related products, and they could be considered completely different in terms of the product market. And what we basically have to take into account here is that the products that the firms produce might be different, but they might be complementary, right? So if we talk about the Axel Springer VIII Sat.1, we could be talking about advertising that would be complementary in this sense. We could also have, related to that, economies of scope, so it means joint production, joint inputs. So if you have a creative mind producing, I don't know, like articles, and would also be producing content that is relevant for television, then we would have joint inputs. Or we could have joint distribution. So if we have a certain product that is related not only to television but also to newspapers or articles or whatever, then we could have synergies in the distribution of these products if we have a conglomerate merger. There could also be, from a pure managerial standpoint, the incentive for empire building. So large firms are always more prestigious, and probably also the managerial pay would be higher if your firm is larger. Also could be issues of risk diversification and stuff like that. And we could also have tying and bundling, so that we have two products that we could bundle together, or we could tie basically the consumption of one product to the consumption of another product, which would basically create potentially increases in profits. Regarding tying and bundling, I would redirect you to the to the industrial organization lecture that is also available on our channel. At that point, we don't want to dig into that in more detail. Okay, so lastly, we have here our appendix, where we have a small introduction on how we can solve these vertically integration problems. So just have a look at this and just try. It probably helps you solve the given problems here. And that would be the end of our merger lecture. So before we stop, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel. If you have questions regarding our topics here, or if you have ideas what we could also do on the channel, or what you want to learn, please leave us some comments below. And if you have any questions regarding economics in general, please feel free to put that in the discussion, and please feel also free to discuss that. That's it for today. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you next time.